And we're back. Welcome, everyone, to episode 3 of the Discourse Corner. This is a show I have for my patrons, and of course, there's a free hour or so for those in the regular audience where I cover memes, various talking points, discourse that goes on online. And in the midst of an election that is focused on immigration, we were just talking about Indian immigration as well right before we went live with respects to what's happening in Canada, that I am joined by a good poster, a man who calls himself a joy poster. I quite like that term. A writer, and his Substack is in the description, but Vulpes, welcome.
Thank you for having me on. So, yeah, how are things right now, or are we just bringing in immediately into the article?
Oh, I mean, we can do a little bit
way.
of everything. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
So, no, the reason why I wanted to have you on is because you had written this article a few months ago that I thought was really insightful, especially as an American in this side of Twitter. Some of my favorite posters and writers are not American and are very much, English as a second or even third or fourth language to them. And so I've always found it interesting that this sort of, public space, the social media, which of course has its origins in the United States, have had such a cosmopolitan impact on how myself and other parts of politics and aesthetics and culture accounts online look at the world. And you wrote this great article called Typing English and Writing Dutch, how language and the way we write influences what we write. And you wrote this back in April. And
Yes.
I'm now finally getting the chance to talk about it, but it's I guess I wanted to just start with you. When did you was English part of your education growing up, or did it come much later?
No, it was part of my education growing up, but the thing is, in Belgium, just quickly, we have what we call common education, which means it's like we have 3 types of schools. We have common education schools, technical schools, and labor schools for like people from 12 till 18. I went to common education, which means if you go to there, you basically going to go to college or university afterwards. You just get a common education, and you learn languages, mathematics, sciences. You can pick Latin or Greek if you want, economics if you want, these kinds of things. So it's in preparation to go to college or university. And in common education, we get English as our third language from the 2nd grade. So that's about 13 to 14. The second language we learn in Belgium is French, and we start with that in 5th year of elementary school, so about 10 years old. So by the time we are learning English, we already have 3 years of French under our belt. But the thing is, because I started already engaging with English when I was, I would say, in my 1st year of high school, maybe even in my last year of elementary school. I started more engaging because I was playing some video games, watching some things, and lots of that was in English. And at some point, I remember it was somewhere in I think it was my 1st year, I got sick of high school for a week. I was not really sick, but I was I couldn't do really things. So what I was started to do was listening to. I couldn't really read, but I was scrolling to YouTube and I came across an audiobook of some young adult novel that I've already read in Dutch translation. It was in English. That why am I going to listen to this? And basically I already had picked up some English from other things, and because of listening to those books, watching lots of YouTube videos and all these things, I basically taught myself English. Because in school, of course, I got some extra grammar was made explicit, all these things, maybe I got some extra vocabulary and the like, but English was something that I never actually ever really started consciously learning English. It just happened to me. It's in a really weird, I just picked it up, and then reading more, listening more, speaking more, and so my English improved a lot over the years. And I think that's the case with quite a few people. They just pick it up, and then in school they might refine it to some degree, learn to speak better, correct some obvious mistakes and the like. But at least with lots of the more intelligent like youths, they learn English basically semi on their own by watching English language media. So that's how I got into English. And then of course I would say by like 14, 15, I was like listening to English audiobooks a couple hours a day. And so by the time I was 16, 17, most of the media I consumed was in English. And so I got lots of exposure to English because of that. And that's to some degree common to many friends. Like they playing video games, they start talking with strangers online, and of course the lingua franca is English. They start posting a little, they start reading some things, and it's of course all in English, because if you want to use the internet well, you have to have a decent knowledge of English. And but of course I'm now mostly talking about like the more intelligent, like 110 IQ plus people who can learn English on their own. It's a difference, and can learn English on their own and can speak it and learn it well, because you have also people underneath that who have some knowledge of English, but it's not good. So in that way, I learned English.
And how long have you been, I guess, posting on Twitter, or I guess just online, like so many of us? I take it for granted that everyone's just kind of been there for forever.
I have been in this sphere since 2016 on Discord mainly.
Mm-hmm.
I basically started in the summer of 20. I started down the path in about February 2016, but I became more active since the summer, and then especially from 2017 on, I was very active in back then it was the height of right-wing Discord servers, so I was very active back then, and so that's where I really started to speak also English with other posters, also posting a lot in English there. So in that way, I got my familiarity with the whole sphere.
Well, I guess that gives us a chance to sort of dive in then on all of this. So you know, you had written this article back in April, about typing English and writing Dutch, and I find I quite like the article. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here to talk about it. But to me, it's always interesting because, as we said before going on the air, a lot of my favorite posters and writers are not American, and are not to say that there aren't Americans who are writers or posters that I don't really enjoy. I mean, I certainly do. I think, Schwab is one of the best writers out there, and by all means, he's an American and an English speaker is his first language. But quite a few writers that are out there are not, and a few posters are there who are not. I have no confirmation if it's true or not. I think Egg Report Randy, I'm pretty sure he's not an American.
No, he's Danish.
Okay. So
he is Danish, but now he's gone on his fake cell arc, and now he ended up in Australia for God knows why. So yeah,
that explains the weird times when he posts. But
yeah, he's been in Australia for 2 weeks right now.
Well, yeah, he's one of my favorite writers, and on Substack at least. I was like, I know he wasn't an American, I just didn't know what he was. But good to know.
He's a Dane, and actually, when I ran my draft of that article through him, and we talked also quite a bit about that influence, also how he experienced it within Denmark. So it was like, because that was one of the very interesting things about that article. It built so many threads that like certain people found certain parts very interesting. And there were quite a few Europeans who really pulled on that part about English and about the difficulty and the tension between the native language and English. But then there were others who were interested in other parts that I pulled in that article. So that was one interesting thing to observe happening.
Well, when you're I mean, like many bilingual people or any multilingual people, you have to do this sort of circumnavigation when thinking about how to say something or even to write it down. What is the proper word or term? You can always tell when an American who who isn't Hispanic or whatever, whenever they talk about whenever they speak in Spanish, because they'll always approximate their American terms and phrases for speaking in another language. So like if you wanted to talk about fixing your hair is a very American English phrase to just comb it or give it a once over. And if you were to say that in Spanish, things like arreglarme, or something like that, they would look at you funny because it's like, well, what do you mean fixing? Like you're gonna take a wrench to your hair or something like that, because it's not the context. What kind of tension or process do you see when it comes to your own writing or your own posting on Twitter?
Like, by and large, my English is very natural in the sense that I don't have to think, like I can think fluently in English if I want. Like I don't have that. I don't like I know people who they say that when they speak they kind of translate. I don't have that because in the way I was so exposed to English that it to a large degree has become as like a second mother tongue is maybe stretched too far, but it's very natural for me to speak English. Like the only time I'll start to make mistakes is when I'm really tired, but even then it's quite fine. But the one thing that I do find that I find difficult, not necessarily difficult, but which gets in the way when I'm speaking English, is that sometimes, because Dutch has a lot of sayings for lots of things, and sometimes I just saying from Dutch in English, because sometimes there are one-on-one relationship. Like sometimes the saying in English exists in Dutch or an adapted version of it. For example, in English you say like to hit two birds with one stone. In Dutch we have a similar saying. It's saying slapping two flies with one slap. It's the same image but said differently. But then sometimes, for example, like forging the iron when hot, I was thinking about it actually like today. Is that an English saying? Forging the iron when it's hot.
Yes, strike the iron while it's hot.
Yeah, strike the iron when it's hot. It's same in Dutch. But sometimes you have like sayings like what we call mixing water and wine. That's not an English saying, but sometimes my mind is like, because Dutch uses so many sayings, I'm just translating them and throwing them in English. So that's maybe the only thing that I sometimes experience some difficulty with. But by and large, at least for me, speaking English is relatively easily and relatively naturally. Like I usually don't have to think about what I'm going to say. I just can say it in English. I don't have like, what am I going to say? Sometimes there's a word that just escapes me, but by and large, I can just talk in English. While French, on the other hand, for me, which is technically my second language, there I have to think much more because I'm not as acclimated with French as I'm with English, and it takes a while for me to start getting in the mindset of speaking French. While with English and Dutch, I can just talk to someone in English, then to talk someone in Dutch, then back in English, then back. Like I can very fluently switch. While with French, that's not the case. With French, I really have to concentrate to speak it well, and even then, I make tons of mistakes. While with English, I don't have to think; I just speak.
Mingling water and wine.
Wine, mixing water and wine is basically making a compromise. That's what the meaning of that saying is. You have wine and you mix it with water and then you dilute it, so you're making a compromise. But that's a very common saying in Flanders.
We would say watering down. Something is watered down. It's diluted. It's not as strong as it could be.
Yeah, and that's like the only thing that I'm sometimes like have to think about. Like, is this a saying in English or is it just a Dutch saying that I'm just translating? But yeah. But of course, that relationship with English depends on the person. Like some people, like a lot of my friends, their English is very, like my high school friends, their English is very good. Like they learned English basically the same way I did, by gaming, by reading in English, by talking in English with lots of people. So their English is of a very high level. My sisters also, their English is also very good because of English media. But then there are some people that they can speak some English, but they are not that good at speaking. They can't hold like intellectual conversations in English. They can do like the basics. They could go on holiday, talk some English to get what they need, to have like basic conversations in English. But the moment it gets too high, they lose it, or they have to concentrate too much. Like it's because that's something people often forget, that it can take a lot of mental energy to speak a second language. Like if you're not really made it your own. Like for me, English is more tiring than speaking Dutch, but it's not that bad. But I know some people, when they speak too much English, then they just become tired really, really fast. And especially when they're tired, they aren't really able to speak coherent English because they're so tired. While speaking Dutch, even when you're tired, you can do it much more easily. So that's also something that, at least as a second language speaker, that you notice. And that also plays a role in conversing with English people.
Well, I figure that would be the case for some. I know that when I try and speak Spanish, if I speak it for too long, I will definitely have that struggle where I have to pause for a minute and not speak as fast as I could if I were in English. So that's I feel like a very common struggle, just to say the least.
It is.
But I mean, I guess on that point, because I have my bio for my Substack post is it's called Musings from the Imperial Heartland, and I mean English being especially Americanized English being the lingua franca of the world. You know, one of the stories that I was told was from my friend Conscious Caracol, Ernst von Zeil from Afriform
I
in
know
South
him
Africa.
quite well.
Yeah, he's a very good guy, and I pray for him constantly.
Yeah.
And he had told me
I've known
this
him since 2016, 2017.
Oh, back when he was
Like we
anonymous.
go back. Yeah. You go back a long way.
Yeah. He and I talk. We used to talk pretty regularly. Not so much with our schedules, but we used to speak pretty regularly, as just off the air, being friendly. And he told me a story a few years ago that has never left me, and it was this story where I think he was in like Johannesburg or somewhere for business, and he had saw someone that looked like him, probably had a very similar background that he did, looked about his age, but he was on the phone speaking this sort of perfect Valley, California, Americanized English, and it caught him very much off guard. And that story's always stuck with me because it's hard to imagine myself being in, somewhere like South Africa and then just to hear an accent or a voice that I would unmistakably identify as American to be all the way down there. And so I guess that's a question I'm just curious, and since you're here, why not ask it? What is that experience like? I guess with not just with your internet work or your posting or your writing, but also your day-to-day life. How much of that sort of culture or that linguistic impact is in your own home?
I hear the perfect American English, or even British. I hear more perfect British, to be honest. Usually, like more like people who, like, for me, I consciously don't put in the effort to learn a perfect accent. I don't want.
Well, I see. Well, I mean that makes sense, but I mean there are these like you mentioned in the article, and I'll read a bit here for. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Oh, okay.
I was saying, like, most people don't really put in the effort to create a really accentless or like a perfect American or British accent. Some people do, especially in more specialized schools. Sometimes that happens, but by and large, I don't hear it that much. But yeah, sometimes you come across it and then it's really, really off-putting. But this is also something that for me, in speaking, the distinct, like, I may have a bit more of an American twang to like word choice and the like, but I was never, or like in school we focus on British English, you mostly, but you can write American if if you're consistent when writing American English. You have to pick one when you're writing in an essay or speaking for like an oral exam or the like. But the thing I've noticed, and some people have remarked on it, when I type, sometimes I'm just mixing British and American spelling, just mixing it because I've not focused and set on I'm speaking American or I'm speaking British. And this is something that happens with quite a few people, that they're maybe because of media they lean more American, but still they will say some things in the British way that an American would never say. So that's also something related to that whole thing. But I can and the thing is, like, if you speak with an obvious British accent, that's the most thing I've heard, then people will usually look straight. If you're a foreigner and not English, will look strange at you, because that usually means you're some kind of diplomat, some kind of high in the European Union administration. That's usually a sign. Like, if somebody speaks with a perfect British accent, they've probably gone to a Europa college and been trained to be an EU working at the European Commission or the European Parliament, if they have like that perfect British accent. So that's also maybe also partly why lots of people don't like it when people speak with a perfect accent. But because for us, for most, English is just a second language. But though there are some people that I've come across that really speak very, like we're saying, with Californian accent, but still then it's not perfect. So it's not as off-putting as that story that Ernst described.
I guess it certainly does depend on maybe where or what media that you, of course, consume. I mean, that culturation is, always there. You're never going to walk away from it completely.
And the thing is, because especially children's media in Belgium, like in Flanders, is just Dutch by and large. So it's not like children just watch Dutch dubs or just like originally made in Flanders or the Netherlands cartoons or media. And while someone in South Africa, I would suppose the chance is much higher that that person is raised bilingually in English, or has a much more early exposure, like heavy exposure to English. So I think that also helps with creating that accent.
Well, I'm going to read a section from your piece here, so people can kind of have an understanding of maybe why I find this so interesting, just because it's perspective I don't get to see a lot. So here we go. Let me find the... here we go. Part of this hatred comes, I admit, from an ingrained Flemish parochialism. I want things to be stable, and I want those who come after me to speak the language of the fathers. I love home and despise the foreign, but in this, of course, lies the danger of becoming too rigid and degenerating into parody. Things do change, and if a culture isn't willing to adapt, it dies. The same is true for language. Things change, and that's a healthy thing. However, beyond this parochial sentiment, the main problem is that English has a stranglehold on Western thought. Everything becomes mediated through English, and thus the world becomes enthralled by a particular worldview that has captured the Anglo mind. I don't think it's a coincidence that the non-Anglo countries where the pause is the strongest, like the Netherlands and Sweden, are the countries with the highest rate of English literacy. It was through high school English textbooks that I had my first IRL experiences with the gay nonsense. And we mentioned earlier in our discussion about different sayings or different, just expressions or cultural affectations. What every language does, of course, limit your worldview, because if you only have words to express something, then those are the only words that you can use, which is a limitation on your frame of reference. Is there, you have a pretty good perception that, of course, of the Anglo mind, being on Twitter, writing in English, being exposed to all this stuff. I mean, what would you say are some of the biggest differences or the biggest oddities that might come from a mind that is really only within English?
But it's the part of it is the unassuming universalism of it. That's a very big thing, especially with Brits. It's less so, but especially with Americans, they can assume that what they know is known by all, or should be known by all. That's the way they view things is the way that all things are and should be, and that's something you quite quickly notice. But beyond that, other ways they like other ways they think about certain subjects. Sometimes there is even like English, when spoken well, has a very it's very nuanced. So, and again, that's something what I say earlier, I think, in the essay, that there is a big difference between English, literary English, that is of Shakespeare, that is spoken by good people of good breeding, of good education, and then the English that is being used as a mass media, and it's mostly that kind of English that creates really the idea that everywhere is the same, because that's really the effect that English has. It makes every place the same, because if I'm in Germany, France maybe less so, but Germany, Spain, Italy, lots of the advertisements will all be the same, or it will all be said in English. It will all be messaging the same thoughts, the same things. So that's a big part of that whole what flows out of that English mind. But then there are other more subtle things, like English is a very good language to express emotions, to express feelings, to have these kinds of monologues of thoughts. And that also colors, at least here, at least that's my not necessarily understanding, but the sense I get about English. For many people, English has that kind of a very emotional side to it. Like, it's like when you're hearing English, when you're like, yeah, that's like certain conversations about certain topics, like the SJWs raging in Dutch, that would just feel weird, because it doesn't seem that it has that kind of animus inside of itself, like the really left. And that's the point I also dare make, is that the are really left-wing agitators are usually extremely Anglophile, in the sense that they've been completely dominated by English, and that's the way they express it. And they've become basically just vessels of the current ideology that's being hegemonic in the English world, and they are its apostles, to use that kind of language. So it's mostly that whole thing. And then, of course, there are more other philosophical things, with, for example, the whole English idea of incrementalism. Like, all these ideas come with the language. Like, just German people, by and large, are different. Flemish people are different. Like, and I think language also determines that partly. Russians are different, Italians are different. But the more they get accustomed to English, the more they start thinking in the ways that global America, to use that, maybe that's a good way to phrase it, thinks. And so they become more like them and less like the people or the place where they come from. So that's a very like large part of that whole thing. And then that's also through those people that, like I was saying, that whole progressivism, or however you want to call it, enters our countries, because it doesn't, because if it would have to be translated, then it would, because of the translation, become interpreted, because every translation is an interpretation. That's a very important thing to keep in mind, that you cannot one-to-one translate. You always, when you translate, you always interpret something. Some key ambiguities, you frame it in a certain way. And because that doesn't happen, leftism, ironically, is everywhere the same. And I think that's also something to keep very much in mind. And that relates because a friend of mine made threw the idea out there that one of the reasons why South Korean feminists are so insane, or like they don't make sense, is because their feminism started because of basically translations there in Korea, and then people building off their own kind of sense of feminism, because apparently it's not the same kind of intersectional feminism as that existing and is hegemonic in the West. It's their own thing, and it's their own like very deranged thing, but it's very different. While the feminism in Belgium is exactly the same thing as the feminism in the United States. There is no difference. It's just one-on-one copy with zero difference. It's same in Poland. It's same in Italy. It's all exactly the same. They care about the same things. They have the same phrases. Maybe it's translated a bit, but it's all totally the same. And I think that's also a thing that's all wrapped up in that whole thing of English dominance. That's, yeah. So I hope that somewhat answers the questions you pose with reading that fragment.
No, it does. I think that's an important thing to remember is that every translation, it is an interpretation, because unless you know one for one the intent or that culture, it's very hard to know the ins and outs of every word.
That sometimes there isn't even really a word for, like, this is one of the funny things, like Dutch is quite unique, and that's, of course, in dialect we maybe have a word for it, but we don't have a separate word for nieces, for nieces, nephews, like we do have neven and nichten, but to separate that from cousins, we just use the same. Like, we don't really have that, and that does have a certain change on that whole dynamic. Like, if you want to, like, even in, like, so that creates a small difference, but if you translate a whole work, such small linguistic differences can really pile up and create a different spin on what you're trying to say. So that's, like you're saying, a very important thing to keep always in mind.
Yeah, and I suppose that your point about South Korea is really interesting, because I haven't followed it too closely, other than to simply know that, we Zero HP Lovecraft made a point not too long ago. It took about maybe 20 years in America for Republicans and Democrats to be more or less divided amongst the sexes. I mean, even Kamala Harris is struggling so hard to get male support. Whereas in South Korea, I know that they had an election a few years ago, and they had called it the incel election, that it was just all men, on the certain issue with its candidacy. And it seems that, South Korean women are cheering on the extinction of their race. And I don't know enough to know how on earth it got to such a point, because like you had said, it's not the American kind of feminism that, we have here. And I wondered if that was lost in translation, or just that they had their own views.
Like I don't know that much about it, but what that friend said is that they base themselves on like one or two iterations back, like 2 or 3 iterations back of feminism, and then use that to build their own thing. While here in the West, we constantly got our updates. Because, and that's also one of the thing, the whole academia is integrated through English. Or like a large part of it, especially that part. That whole activist side of academia is one network of English, because in what language do most publish? Not in their native language, in English. Like even in countries like France or Germany, where there is still quite a bit of publication in their native language, still not an insignificant amount is translated, and still more is not translated but written in English primarily. Because again, it's that reach, but that creates its own problems, I think. But that's maybe a discussion for later in the article.
Yeah, no, I mean it raises an interesting question. Is just because I've noticed, and I wonder, because you mentioned earlier that universalization, that or these universal assumptions, there's this tendency, and I don't know if it's purely an American or this English speaking concept, but there's this desire to always unify everything together, this grand theory of progressivism or wokeness or whatever people want to say. And there's always this desire to point out how everything comes together or how everything can be related. And I feel like it's a very American university-esque experience that, trying to make explanation for why things are all interconnected. And that can be partially based on mathematics, but also I think a lot of just Enlightenment philosophy. And I don't know if that exists elsewhere.
I think it does exist elsewhere, but I think that whole, especially at least in what I'm getting, like in the US, that whole focus about that we must establish the genealogy to find the point where everything turned wrong. That's at least to me feels more of an American thing. Like this, like to the desire to have like the exact place, the exact time to put on the point for the blame of like, here it went wrong, and here everything went downhill. I think that's a bit of an American idea, but I'm speculating a little too much on that. But maybe you're probably onto something with that.
Yeah, I think that's the proper word, would be genealogy. That we want to point out exactly where things went wrong, rather than where how everything's connected. There is this desire to trace this grand history. And I notice this happens all the time when we debate our own history as Americans. Some people will try their best to offer a revision, to say, I'll use Sandbach as an example. He'll love to try his best to provide a revision to a revision that already exists. You have this post-war consensus of conservatism in America, which is very de-anglicized. American conservatism after World War II becomes very German, very Jewish, and very Catholic. And so FDR and Woodrow Wilson become these big bad guys. And I think that there's good reason to make that argument, at least for FDR. And he's very adamant to defend otherwise. And so you're noticing that there's these battles for genealogy and for history and for narrative. And to me, that feels like a very Anglo, very English thing to do, to defend history that way.
Because that doesn't really... I don't think there's really an authentic, like that kind of way of thinking about history on the continent. I don't, and if it's there, it's important because of American, like its importance into the continent from the outside, because the whole idea of like, why would you try to like revise history? But now there are people trying to do that, like decolonialism and like this old hero of like France or whatever. we are going to deconstruct and to revise the traditional understanding of history. That's not a thing that's been traditionally done a lot. Like maybe, of course, you have the whole postmodernist and critical theory in France that also exists there, but even then, it's not that not in the American way, because not like in America, it's the right who also does this lovingly to like actually these people were the heroes. It's that kind of thing that's often happens in even in the American right, but the whole Civil War is a hotbed of that whole issue, or even going back to the American Revolution. You have all these people like, no, actually, what is it? Jackson was evil. No, he was actually the good guy, because like the whole, like, you know what I'm talking about, that kind of thing. And it's not that common here. Some people have some spicy takes on history, but by and large, there is very rarely people say like, it's kind of like strange for a Flemish person who would say like, actually King Charles the Great was like the villain of history, and it's like, what? He was a king of the Franks, a great king. He ruled the large Frankish Empire in the 9th century. He accomplished much, but like to find some secrets good side, it's not something that would naturally come up. But of course, it's historically sometimes have happened, especially with the building of nations. Like and when something like this happens, yeah, there is some revisionism, because everything has to be fit into the image of the nation. But beyond that, it's even doesn't really make sense. Like, who cares if you're not making a nation building project? Then why would you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to frame history in a certain way? What's the point of it? Because it's often seems to turn like that whole revisionism out of Civil War or even World War II or the American Revolution. It seems like an wish fulfillment, like intellectual pleasuring. Just like, actually, we're on the right side. We are correct. I find it a strange thing, but I've not thought enough about it to put it like perfectly into words. But it's an interesting thing also to think about.
Yeah, no, and I think that is particularly interesting because, the only person I could think of maybe across the on the other side of the pond would maybe be Ernst Nolte with the European Civil War. Outside of that, there have been numerous other I guess maybe historians dispute, these writings about how there is there was a Vietnam, or not Vietnam, there was a European Civil War, just throughout that time. I know he's not the only person to make that argument, although he had certainly, he wrote quite a bit about that in the 80s. And so maybe there's that Germanic influence as well to rewrite or to claim that there are villains in history. But I feel like that's such a post-war thing.
Yeah, I think the main difference is that in the past, at least, those kinds of revisionisms were always linked with nation building, with creating a nation, and to have it one common origin, one common purpose. While that's whole private way of revisionism, like, because that's something that's like I was thinking about, that's something that also happens actually in the Balkans, that very revisionism, that's being very bound by history, but then trying to see everything in its own light. I think that's in some way, I think it's a sign of powerlessness, of being stuck. I think that's also something related to that, because if you're building and if you're going forwards, why would you have to spend so much time about those minutiae? So I think that's also something to think about in that whole conversation. And again, something maybe when I'm speaking about the continent, I'm very much speaking about Western and Central Europe, because there is a distinction between everything east of Germany and south of Austria, like southeast of Austria, in their mentality and in their way of doing things. That's also sometimes not enough appreciated, I think, by Americans. The line between the Balkans and Middle Europa, or whatever you want to call it, does exist. Difference in mentality does exist, even with Italians and the other side of the Adriatic Sea does exist. That's also a nuance that should be kept in mind. But that's not that relevant to the topic we are discussing right now.
No, but I think it does play a large part in perhaps how it's so easy to characterize things in the United States. I mean, for large part, I mean, our language and our understanding of the world are brought on by those universal assumptions. Just Europe is Europe. They don't. Most people in America would just tell you up front. I mean, most people are just geographically illiterate. And that you see this with Ukrainian policy in the United States, that the more people did not know where Ukraine, if they couldn't find Ukraine on a map, they were far more inclined to offer up more, stronger policies or militant action against Russia. And those that were closer and closer on the map to where Ukraine was, they had a more nuanced opinion. And so there's that just sort of general ignorance, but also I think that for America being, the size of the European continent, we take so much for granted just by terms of size. And, we have sort of regional identities. Sure, in America, you have your Northerners, your Southerners, your Californians, your Midwestern, some places are large enough to have their own identity, like Texas. But I think people just don't contextualize that to Europe at all.
And that's one very big thing that to understand. And it's also partly in that whole paragraph you read why I was talking about parochialism. In some way, most Europeans are to some degree parochial, in the sense that because of our language and borders, like language cultures, our borders are much stronger. Like I could, but it would be one hell of a deal to move to even Berlin for me, from where I live. Like, of course, I could, in these big cities, you can survive as an expat with English. You can. It's not always that pleasant, because you miss lots of things. You isolate yourself quite a bit, because through the Orthodox Church, I come into contact with lots of foreigners, to basically say it that way. And some people, they have, if they're not yet speaking Dutch, they have really, really difficulty to really integrate into society, because even though you can be on many places with English, you cannot touch the heart of the country, of the city. Like, there are many events, especially if you're raising children, if you do not know Dutch and you're not part of some ethnic community, you miss a lot. And that's something that Americans, and that's also whole related to that whole language thing, that it makes it really difficult to permanently move somewhere else, because the differences between one place and another place are much, much more distinct. Even in my Flanders, regional tastes are much more distinct. Like, if I go to the other side of the country, I really feel that I'm in the other side of the country. They speak different. They act in some ways somewhat different. Going to the Netherlands, especially the north, is really a different country to me. Like, yeah, we speak kind of the same language, but the Northern Dutch are really, really different from the Flemish. Like, you just, the way they act, the way they behave, it's the way they think, it's very different. And that makes it that's inherently that everything has to be more rooted. While in the United States, like you hear people, they move every 5 years, and then they move like, what is it, to a new state, or like 20 states over from east to west coast. And that's mind-boggling, especially, yeah, that is mind-boggling. And of course, here in Europe, you have some people who, yeah, they move, but it's not to that degree, and those people who move will always feel that they're not part of the new place they went to, because it's so different from the other places. And the thing what English, like the prevalency of English has made that moving somewhat easier, because in all main cities you can do lots of things with English. But like I was saying, even then you do not touch the heart of it. And that's also a whole thing related to that whole language question, and the difference between Americans and Europe. And that's why, like, some Americans would say, like, oh, you want some better paying job, just move 2,000 miles. If I move 2,000 miles, I'm in Poland. Like, Poles are very different. Like, why would I want to live in Poland? Like, I do not have any bloods there. I do not, like, why? And that's also a thing related with language, because I want to move and really become part of Poland. I should learn Polish, because I was just speaking English. I would never touch. I would firstly mostly talk with highly educated Poles or with just other expats or foreigners, which already limits my being in that place. While in the States, if you move from New York to Los Angeles, you'll be speaking English with almost everybody, or from Houston to to Denver, Colorado. Like, yeah, sure, you just move there and you can talk with everybody without really a problem. While in Europe, that doesn't work. You can't really do that.
Yeah, I mean, when I lived in Germany for a good chunk of change when I was a child, and it's mind blowing back then, just as it is today, that you can take a car or a train for 4 or 5 hours and you can cross the country very quickly and then be in one or two other countries in the same time, and by driving through their borders.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I can drive for 4 hours in almost any direction, and I'm still in the state of Texas.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's something, and most Americans will move quite often. I think Scott Greer had pointed it out in an article about being deracinated, that the average American moves roughly 11 times in their lifetime, compared to maybe three or four in Europe.
That's insane. Like, I've moved once 2 kilometers from my old house to a new house that is objectively better. But like in the same part of town, just 2 kilometers further away. And
Well,
most people I know have, like, they've, at least in their whole childhoods, you just stay in the same place. Like, moving during your childhood is really, really rare. Like, rare. The only times, and of course it's now happening more, is because of divorce. But if no divorce, then why move? So yeah.
Well, I think it also has a lot to do with either economic opportunity, or, I mean, divorce happens a lot. University.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've had family that traveled hundreds, if not 1,000 miles to go to a different school, or to take on a job and things like that.
That just does not happen in Europe. At most, somebody would move to, for example, in France, to Paris, to the capital. Or in Germany. In Germany, it's less so, because Germany is much more decentralized. But like, moving to the capital is something that can happen for work. But even often, lots of people, if they can, they just commute. Because, like, why would I leave home to settle a place where I work? Like, I prefer to stay at home and not move closer to work. That's actually, like, some leftoids are annoyed about this, that people in Belgium and in lots of places in Europe, they just prefer to stay where they grew up and then work somewhere else, instead of moving to where they they work. But of course, like Europe is smaller scale, and especially the low countries is a much smaller scale. Like you can drive from one side to the other side in 2.5 hours, even though we consider that a very long and far distance. But it's all much more manageable. But again, it speaks to a whole different sense of things. And that's the more somebody becomes Anglo, like speaks English, but also becomes enthused in that whole English way of thinking, the less place becomes relevant for them. Because we have, do you know what Erasmus is?
No, I don't.
No, so Erasmus is an European Union program, which basically means that students in university can have one semester, like of course, depending on certain agreements between your own university and other universities and the faculties and the like, have like a semester in another country. And usually the people who do that are, of course, middle class, upper middle class. But the thing is, and that's why lots of people don't like Erasmus students, is because the thing is they're all international. They move somewhere. Of course, they don't at least speak the language. Like somebody moving from Italy or from Spain to Belgium, like they're not going to know Dutch, except it's maybe like one of those rare cases who studies Dutch at university. But then they start to coalesce in their own enlightened group of expats or like Erasmus students. And this is something you see quite often, and why people hate passport bros and the like, because they create their own separate, isolated thing, and they are not part of the country. They are just like living there for a while. And that's also, and of course they all know English, because English on all these events is a lingua franca. Everybody speaks English there. So these are also things that make it all like that is an impact of an impact, that is an influence of English on European society. And of course people mainly speak English to one another, and then you create like those very funny situation where just you have like 10 people from all different nationalities, and where they're speaking with one another English. So yeah,